Mr. President, I'd like to elaborate on the comments of my colleague from Texas, who I think laid out in very clear terms what's at stake in the debate that we're having here, and really what the vote that we're going to have here in the not-too-distant future means. Because I think it's pretty clear, if you look at any objective measurement, any metric, that Obamacare is a huge disaster. And obviously we've seen tremendous anecdotal evidence of that. You travel your state or around the country, you talk to anybody who is in business, and the message comes back very clear that Obamacare is making it more difficult and more expensive for them to create jobs. It's creating a lot of uncertainty. There are mandates and requirements associated with the new law because employers are being forced to provide a government-approved plan, and so costs go up. That means there are people that aren't getting hired that otherwise might have gotten hired, companies that are looking at reducing their workforce, and obviously just creating a tremendous amount of disruption in our economy. And I think that's pretty evident that the middle class in particular is being crushed by the President's policies, and Obamacare is certainly no exception. Yesterday, we saw in Forbes magazine, Avik Roy reported on a recent study that was done by the Manhattan Institute that Obamacare will increase insurance rates for younger men by an average of 97 to 99%, and for younger women by an average of 55 to 62%. Well, in my home state of South Dakota, that is more than just a statistic. It is a grim reality facing thousands of young men and women. By comparing a typical low-cost plan for a healthy 30-year-old in South Dakota this year with a bronze plan in South Dakota's health care exchange next year, the premium increases, Mr. President, are staggering. Younger women are going to face a 223% premium increase, and younger men are going to face a 393% premium increase when you compare new data from the Health and Human Services Department with data that came out from the Government Accountability Office about premiums in my state just this year earlier in January. So for those millennials in South Dakota, that's a $1,500 increase in health care premiums each year for women, and more than a $2,000 increase in health care premiums for men. So the money that could be used for other things is now going to be going toward this increase in health insurance premiums that people are going to have to pay to get covered. So they could have been using that to pay off a student loan. They could have been using it to save for a home or to start a family. And so this has a tremendous impact on the economy, and particularly those who are going to get hardest. In my state of South Dakota, not unlike other states around the country, it's young people, younger men and younger women. Now, interestingly enough, the administration and the President are out talking about how the HHS study or report confirms what they've been saying, that somehow premiums are going to go down. Well, the reason they are saying that, Mr. President, is they are comparing the exchange premiums, what they think people are going to pay, with what CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, predicted they might pay earlier this year. And so it's a hypothetical, it's a mythical comparison. There's nothing to it. It's fiction, if you will. And so what you've got to do is make this real for people. And when you make it real, when you compare it to what they are paying today, young people in particular are going to see dramatic increases in their premiums. And so the study was the report was a complete fraud in terms of giving and informing people real information about what their health insurance premiums are going to be under these exchanges. And as I just pointed out, when you compare what they would be paying under the exchanges in my state of South Dakota with what people are paying today for similar type coverage, the increases are staggering. 223% premium increase for younger men, and for younger women, and 393% increase for younger men. Now, they're going to say, well, some of these individuals are going to be eligible for premium tax credits to help cover the increased cost. But not everyone is eligible for those premium tax credits. There are going to be a lot of people who are not going to be eligible for the credits, and those credits don't cover all the cost. According to a new analysis by Avalier Health, Americans could face steep cost-sharing requirements like co-payments, co-insurance, and deductibles layered on top of the monthly premiums, which are going to increase dramatically. It is clear that health care costs are going up, particularly for younger Americans. Now, President Obama promised that health care premiums would go down by an average of $2,500 per family. If you look at what the real situation is with regard to families, Mr. President, those premiums have actually jumped by more than $2,500 since the President took office and since Obamacare became law. So we've got costs that continue to increase despite the President's promises to the contrary. Household income has been dropping since the time the President's been in office, about $3,700 according to a recent study. And so when you sit there and if you're an American family and you're looking at your economic situation, you're saying, now let me get this straight. I have higher costs and lower incomes. How does the President suspect that we're going to be able to cover these higher costs? Well, that's the reality, as I said, that most Americans are dealing with, and that people in my state of South Dakota, particularly as millennials, who are going to be most adversely and harmfully impacted by the new plan, are going to be dealing with. Now, with respect to jobs, the other thing I'd like to point out, because obviously the cost of health care is a very, very important situation and something that every American has to think about as they think about their own personal economic circumstances. But you also have to have jobs, and most people get health insurance coverage, a lot of them do, through their job. Well, what is the Obamacare legislation doing to jobs and to our economy? Nearly 3 in 4 small businesses plan to fire workers or to cut hours as a result of Obamacare. According to Investors Business Daily, more than 250 employers have cut jobs or slashed hours as a direct result of Obamacare's high-cost and job-killing regulations. Now, the other thing that's important to point out is 60% of the jobs that have been created this year, 60% of the jobs created this year are part-time jobs, not full-time jobs, part-time jobs, because the way the Obamacare legislation and the law is structured, it is a disincentive for companies to grow, because if they get bigger, if they get more than 50 employees, they're subject to a lot of these new regulations and mandates and requirements that they provide government-approved health care. There is also a definition in the law of what a full-time employee is. So if you are someone who works more than 30 hours, you're a full-time employee. So what are companies doing, businesses doing? They're hiring more and more people to work 29 hours a week. The President's probably going to go down in history as the President who created the most part-time jobs, but Americans want full-time jobs. They want to be able to have a job that allows them to make ends meet for their families, to plan for their children's education and for their own retirement, and having to work more than one job, multiple part-time jobs, just doesn't get it done for them. And so that's why we see this trend occurring of part-time jobs being created, largely because of mandates imposed in Obamacare. The middle class is being squeezed from both ends. Americans' premiums are going up while their hours and take-home pay are going down. The jobs impact are as clear across the country as they are in my state of South Dakota, but I want to give you one example of a South Dakota business owner who was recently interviewed. And he was asked in that interview about the higher costs and mandates of Obamacare, and this is what he said, and I'll quote, "You'll just have to adjust accordingly, and you'll have to cut jobs. And you probably won't hire as many people. And I think you'll see a lot of that." End quote. That's a small business owner in my state of South Dakota responding to a question about the impact of Obamacare on his ability to hire people, to create jobs, and to help expand his business and grow the economy in my state. Now, it's no wonder, Mr. President, that the President's approval rating is underwater. Nearly 60% of Americans say they oppose Obamacare, and it is the President's signature accomplishment. And so while the President's signature, the support for the President's signature law continues to fade, we're also seeing that it's impacting the President's personal approval rating. For the first time, more Americans view the President unfavorably than they do favorably. And according to yesterday's Gallup poll, the President's struggling with his own base. Support among Democrats has dropped 13 points since December of 2012. I say all that to point out, Mr. President, that the effects of these policies, and particularly Obamacare in the specific, is having an impact on the President's standing, and I think that people are understanding what the impacts are, what the effects of this are, what the results of this are, and they're starting to react accordingly. Now, the other thing I guess I would mention, which is of great concern, I think, to anybody who is thinking about going into an exchange or looking to this next week when the exchanges, quote, go live or go online, is that there are an awful lot of glitches and bumps. You've got, as I said, premiums on the rise, workers' jobs, wages, and hours are being cut, and glitches and bumps when it comes to implementation. The latest example of an Obamacare glitch comes from the District of Columbia exchanges. A report that came out just yesterday said the District of Columbia Obamacare exchange is experiencing, and I quote, a high error rate. A high error rate, Mr. President, in calculating the tax credits that low and middle income people are going to receive. You can't make this stuff up. The government-run exchange is rendering, and I quote, a high error rate in handling your health care. Well, who would have thought that that would be the case? These exchange shoppers are not going to have access to the premium prices now until mid-November. It's according to that recent report on the District of Columbia. Well, there's similar glitches happening at the federal level as well, and in other states. Oregon and Colorado have faced setbacks. Reuters reports on Monday, and I quote again, employees running Connect for Health Colorado told board members that the exchange would not be able to calculate federal subsidies either, at least for the first few weeks, end quote. Inaccuracies, glitches, malfunctions mean this law is not ready for prime time. And meanwhile, we've got top Democrats here in the Congress who I think are in complete denial. The President said earlier this summer, I think it's important for us to recognize and acknowledge that this is working the way it's supposed to. Representative Pelosi on the House side said the implementation of this is fabulous. Senator Reid said on Meet the Press here not too long ago, Obamacare has been wonderful for America. Well, that message is being lost on Americans, Mr. President. We have an opportunity to correct that. We get a chance at a do-over here. We can fix this. We can correct this wrong. We can do this in a much better way. It didn't take a 2,700-page bill and 20,000 pages of regulations to fix the problems that we have in our healthcare system today. But what we have now is a government takeover of 1/6 of our economy, and we are seeing what that means for many Americans. Higher premiums, higher costs, fewer jobs, lower take-home pay, glitches and bumps when it comes to implementation. At a minimum, Mr. President, what we ought to do is delay the implementation of this, not just for a favored few, not just for those select constituencies that the President wants to grant waivers and exemptions, but we ought to allow a delay of this for all Americans because it is not ready for prime time. And I think ultimately maybe what drives or motivates people to stay with us in spite of all this, every day news stories, news organizations, headlines talking about the flaws, the errors in implementation, the promises that were made by the administration when it comes to what costs were going to be for people and whether or not they'd be able to keep their own insurance. But when you look at all that, the cumulative effect of all that, the wise thing I think for us to do is to recognize that this was a mistake and at a minimum, delay its implementation. At the best, my favorite scenario would be that we repeal it and we start over. But I think we've got a lot of people here, as was mentioned by Senator Reid not too long ago, whose goal really is to get to a single-payer system. And if that's your goal, then you want this thing to muddle along and get so bad that the only alternative people are left with is a single-payer system. In other words, socialized medicine. And I don't think that's consistent with what the American people want, and certainly not consistent with our history and heritage of freedom and competition and giving people in this country more choices. And that might explain why many of the things that we have proposed, alternatives that we have proposed on this side of the aisle, consistently get voted down. Why don't we allow people to buy insurance across state lines, create interstate competition? That drives prices down. Why don't we allow pooling for small businesses so that they can get the benefit of group purchasing power? Why don't we reduce the cost of defensive medicine by ending junk lawsuits in this country? Why don't we allow people to have their own refundable tax credit so they can buy their own health insurance? and come up with a system that's portable, that creates competition, that allows people to have more choices, that is based upon market impulses and market principles. When you got a free market and it's working, Mr. President, you get much lower costs because competition brings that about. Well, I hope we can get to that point where we say that this was the wrong direction. We're going to have a chance to vote on that later today. The vote that's going to be before us, and I'm not aware of any Republican in this chamber who's not going to vote to defund Obamacare. We have an opportunity as Republicans and Democrats to acknowledge what the American people have already recognized, and that is that this is not working. It's not working as it was intended. It's not working as planned. And the best thing that we can do is to acknowledge that, give the American people a break, give the American economy a break by delaying its implementation, and more importantly, just repealing it and starting over and doing this the right way, building upon the strengths that we have in our healthcare delivery system today, acknowledging that there are challenges and weaknesses, but things that can be fixed without passing a 2,700-page bill and 20,000 pages of regulations. Madam President, I yield the floor.